Meine sehr verehrten Damen und
Ladies and gentlemen, I am Mr. Vip, and I am president of the Swiss Federation of Protestant Churches. I am happy to welcome you here on behalf of the co-organizers of the Open Forum. Welcome you to this last concluding event with an extremely interesting panel composition. The co-organizers this year are the Association of Churches, the Bread for All, and NGOs and WEF. They have organized an event for the public on the topics that are discussed by WEF for the public and should be highlighted from the point of view of your opinions. A communication for the media. The organizers will invite you after the meeting is closed and once it has been evacuated for a press briefing to take stock of the events this year at the Open Forum. I don't need to introduce you to the moderator today, who is a journalist at Swiss television, Stephan Klapproth. I'm pleased to give him the floor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to meet you here at this last session of the Open Forum in Davos, an event where we should discuss very openly whether globalization or deglobalization is better or not for the poor countries of the world. Nearly 50% of the population have to work 2 days before they can even buy a Big Mac at one of the McDonald's. And if they want to buy a Coke, they would have to work for 8 hours in a tanner in India or somewhere in the field in Africa. Since last Wednesday, Davos was the counting point of the economic sector, where powerful men and women have been discussing about the world's economy and have also discussed the cohabitation and coexistence of religions. Dick Cheney, the Vice President of the United States, answering Mr. Schwab, said that the Americans were not wanting to build up a world empire. That's good news. Just as it was good news to hear Mr. Bush announced his plans for flying to the moon, because I think many Europeans wish him on the moon anyway. Well, your reaction shows that that is a rather strange way of saying that the conflicts are very tense, and even though the tension between the Europeans and the Americans were not so clear this year as last year, there's still a lot of tension in these questions of power and power sharing. But I'm very happy to have such a wonderful group of panelists here. Before I introduce them to you, I would like to tell you that we have Minister of Finance from one of the very important countries in Africa. We have a Nobel Prize winner. We have the director of an international organization here. And we have a person who also fights for the poor. And I, in their midst, I'm just a journalist. I'll never win a Nobel Prize. I'll never certainly become a director of an international organization. I have a very simple brain, the brain of a journalist, and you know that we are simplifiers. We only know 3 questions for whatever subject you are discussing. Who is the bad guy, who is the good guy, and who will win? So these are the 3 simple questions that we'll try and find answers to. Well, maybe we can refine these questions a little bit later on. But let me then start with the Minister of Finance on my left, sorry. Madam Minister of Finance of Nigeria, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She already has a brilliant career behind her. She finished summa cum laude in Harvard, has studied at the MIT. She's been to the major American journalists. Journalist brain would say she actually studied at the Enemies Center of universities, and she then had a very brilliant career after finishing her studies, and she is now Minister of Finance of her country. Nigeria, 130 million inhabitants with a GDP which is quite tremendous. So my journalist's very simplified question, who's the bad guy? Where do you think is the worst problem when it comes to globalization? Who would have to do something most urgently? You have the floor, madam.
Well, thank you very much. I love your wonderfully simplified way of phrasing issues. You know, if only we could have the world into bad guys, good guys, and winners, it would make things a lot easier for people from developing countries. But I guess I have to, as a Minister of Finance, answer, I guess, responsibly and gravely. In terms of globalization, I'm a very practical person. I just want to say that we might say globalization or deglobalization. I think that globalization is here to stay. And the question is, how do we deal with it? How do we make sure that it includes the poor people in the developing countries, many of whom are in my own country, where the income per capita is just about $300. So we're not a rich country, we're a poor country. And I think the good thing about globalization is that it offers opportunities, you know, for trade, for interaction, for commerce, for economic interdependence that could be beneficial to the developing countries. I think what we are finding now is that because of policies that are being pursued by many developed countries, the globalization and this interdependence are not working as well for the developing countries as it should. Everybody knows...
So that's the bad guy. That's my bad guy. Well, the developed countries.
Well, you know, I mean, I'm coming to a second point I want to make. The first is you all know about the agricultural subsidies. The fact that $300 billion of subsidies being given by the developed countries to agriculture is equal to the total GDP of the whole of Africa, you know, every year. And that a cow, this famous saying that a cow is being subsidized to the tune of $2 a day, when most people in the developing world, 1.5 billion, are living under $1 a day. These are things that we need to think about. So we'd like the developed countries to amend their subsidies and open their markets so that developing countries can benefit. Now, does that mean that developing countries don't have to do something? That's where the second part comes. We also need to reform our countries inside. We need to deal with corruption. We need to govern our countries better. We need to put in place the right policies so we can take advantage of the interdependence and the globalization. I'll end with just one saying, which I repeated early this morning. In my language, there's a saying that goes, my language is Igbo. Onye lo no ga-eji ofu aka wee na-akụ aka na asịla onwe ya asị. It means that you cannot clap. If you think you can clap with one hand, then you're fooling yourselves. You know, it means you need two hands, and we're in a world where two hands are needed, and there's interdependence. Thank you.
Ein wunderbares Bild.
Wonderful picture. You cannot clap with one hand. You need two hands to clap, so let's use them.
Und wir kommen zu den
I'm sure we'll be able to come back to the questions of agriculture. Now, right next to me, we have the Nobel Prize winners, one of the most well-known economists of the world, and I think the economist that George Bush would love to shoot up to the moon, or even better, to Mars, Joseph Stiglitz. He's also been on the inside of the institutions. He used to be the top economic advisor of Bill Clinton. Then he was the head economist of the World Bank. So he really knows all the ins and outs, and he writes these wonderful books, The Shadows of Globalization, and he describes what is good and what is bad in globalization. So would you join in this game of journalistic simplification? Who's the bad guy?
Well, I agree with Ngozi. There's not a single bad guy. There are several bad guys. I'll pick up a couple of others that she's left out of the list. One of them is that, well, the international trade regime has been, I think, very unfair to the developing countries, and it's not just agriculture. Agriculture has gotten a lot of attention, but there are lots of other issues. There are a whole set of things called non-tariff barriers. So what happens is, as soon as a country gets successful in competing, the United States or Europe says that they're dumping. And their argument is, if they can compete against us, they must be unfair, because we know we could always win. So the result of that is it keeps out a whole variety of goods from developing countries. That's just another one of, say, a whole list of issues that should be on the table if you were making a true development round, and unfortunately it's not been. But another thing, another one that I've talked about in this book, and is the IMF. And let me try to explain why it's an important part of the problem. One of the things that happens when trade, if trade liberalization is to be successful, is a very simple idea that you're supposed to move resources from protected areas where they're inefficient to more efficient export sectors. So you're supposed to move them from less productive to more productive areas, and that will increase income. And that seems like, well, why could anybody object to that? Well, the problem is that in many developing countries, there's a high level of unemployment. And if people are already unemployed, and then you engage in certain kinds of trade liberalization, you're going to get more unemployed. Then, if the IMF comes in and says you have to have high interest rates, you have to have very tight budgets, it makes the unemployment problem even worse. They're always worried about inflation being around the corner. Sometimes it is, and sometimes they have a legitimate concern. But in a very large fraction of the cases, they worry about inflation when it's not a serious problem. And the real thing is, they don't worry about unemployment.
Why do they do this? Warum tun sie das?
Why do they do this?
Bad guys, or did they not understand the theory, do the homework? Also machen die das böswillig, oder sind die ökonomisch nicht so gescheit wie ein Nobelpreisträger?
Well, that's one of the hardest questions. Why are they so? Why do they focus on inflation? Now, I think part of it is that their interest and their ideology very much differ from what is reasonable, what most economists think, and what is right for developing countries. The framework which they approach an awful lot of economic problems is that markets work perfectly. If markets work perfectly, there would be no unemployment. So for them, unemployment doesn't exist. Now, that's a very funny, you know, when I tell people who are not economists about this, they say they scratch their head, they can't believe it. But unfortunately, it is a view that is taught in a number of universities around the world. So part of it is this peculiar view of economics. But the second problem is the IMF reports, the people who govern the IMF are central bank governors and finance ministers. Now, they tend to think a lot more about the problems of the financial markets than they do about the problems of workers. Just a natural part of who they talk to.
Except in developing countries.
Ja, es gibt gute Finanzminister auch.
There are good finance ministers as well.
So let me so the consequence is, if you have a long-term bond and inflation goes up, the value of your bond goes down. So what they see is inflation has this enormously negative effect on those who own government bonds. They may not know anybody who might be thrown out into unemployment. Mm-hmm. So for them, they see the reality of inflation as being a cost, but they don't see the reality of unemployment as being a cost. And so that inevitably affects how they approach economic problems. And then the final thing is that because they have often been in a very insulated atmosphere, you know, they haven't participated in dialogues like this, they don't hear other views. So they talk to each other, and as they talk to each other, they all agree that inflation is the most important problem. And as you know, they talk to, and then they say, oh yes, that's true, and they go back and forth, and they become more and more convinced that they're right.
Versuchte als Weltbankökonom.
Mr. Klapproth is just summarizing what Mr. Stiglitz has just said. I think after all that, Mr. Stiglitz was then simply thrown out by the World Bank because he looked for all the information. So he's saying that people think about inflation, but not the workers, women and men who live in these countries. I don't think that we could ask a more interesting, a more expert man to come in on this than the director of the international organization that has as a mission to deal with labor and labor laws, the ILO, the International Labor Organization. And we have with us today the Director General, Mr. Juan Somavia. He is a Chilean. He has fought for democracy in his country. He's got a very interesting past, and he's now the Director General of the ILO. So when you hear all this, Mr. Somavia, when you hear that the specialists of the trade organizations and financial organizations don't think of the human being behind all of this in the developing countries, is that also one of the central problems for you and issues in your work?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for all of you for coming on a Sunday to this panel. Let me put in figures what Joe has just said. Let me give you some figures of the Latin American reality, social figures. From the year 1980 to 2003, that's more than 20 years, unemployment has gone up by 50%. The informal economy outside of the protection of the formal economy has gone up 50%. The coverage of social security systems have come down by 30%. And the purchasing power of the minimum wage in 23 years has come down 25%, and even 50% in 9 countries. Now, I won't say that every one of these figures is the fault of the economic policies. There are a lot of national problems, national corruption. Ngozi mentioned some of them. But certainly, this has not been economic policies that have solved the problem, let me put it that way. So we are now facing the reality that we need to move from a vision that is centered on monetary and financial affairs to listening to people. Now, what is it that people are saying today throughout the world? I think that the single most significant democratic demand is that people are saying, families, communities, are saying, look, give me the opportunity at decent work. Give me the opportunity of a decent job. And I will take care. I will take care of myself, of the family, we live in a community that is more at peace because it's a community at work. And this is the biggest demand that these sets of economic policies do not respond to. So there is evidently a necessary change. Let me tell you, I don't think that it's any longer a debate among, what's the best economic policy. This has become a political problem. The ILO just put out the figures, the latest figures on official unemployment with all the limitation that has. It's the highest level that has ever been, around 128 million people in the world. But if you add to that the underemployed and the working poor, you are around 1 billion people. And that today is not any longer a problem of what's the better economic policy, it's a political problem. This is probably the biggest source of insecurity that the world has. We have been hearing a lot about security issues in Davos, but security issues linked to the terrorism. I would like to put on the table the security issues linked to human beings. You know, parents that don't have jobs produce child labor.
Who has to act in the first place now? Wer muss jetzt handeln zuerst, dringlich?
We all have to act. First of all, it has to become a democratic demand. I think it is a democratic demand already, if you want to listen, because there's no single politician in the world that can go to an election today without offering something in the field of work. So this is already a democratic demand, but it is not. There's not there's not the political response to it, and we continue to have. Although we can identify the problem, we can know that it has to be the society as a whole that reacts and finds solutions. We continue to have the same policy. So just to finalize on that, it's evident that the international organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, the ILO, the WTO, have to work together on a policy coherence that produces the jobs that the people are asking. We're not working together today because, for different reasons, everyone is looking at the problem from a sectorial point of view. There are many other answers. There's not one single answer to this, but one of them is that the international organizations are not performing their duty today. And our principal duty today is to work together on an integrated economic and social policy that produces jobs and decent jobs for people. That's our main responsibility today, and it's not being done.
Thank you. Then
Christoph Stückelberger, a well-known activist in Switzerland, Secretary General of Bread for All, one of the founders also of this open forum. He was behind the idea of this open forum. I think you have attended the 7 past fora. This is the 8th. What is coming out of these open fora? We are trying to summarize the work that has been done so far. Do you seem to see a general tendency, the direction we are setting off in, where we can do something? Well, thank you very much. Simply to link up to what has been said by the 3 previous speakers, there seems to be a red thread running through what they have said, especially also in what Mr. Somavia has said. What is the role of the individual, the human being, in this process of globalization? This is a very basic question indeed, even if it was not expressed that clearly in all of the 8 past fora. The demand of a human-centered globalization, that is the claim. Globalization in the service of the individual, not in the service of some abstract idea of globalization. And if we can bring about this change in our minds and hearts, then I think this would give us the yardstick to judge whether globalization is negative or positive. Now, a second thing that seems to be emerging from these 8 past events, or 8 last years of having organized the Open Forum, is the fact that there are very few people have said that globalization is basically negative and that one has to withdraw and retract to regional or national positions, protectionism being the only solution with which we can protect human beings. Everyone seems to have said in one way or another that globalization does have a lot of positive sides, but we need to have better control over the negative sides. So implicitly, we seem to be basing ourselves on the fact that this worldwide networking is a fact of life and that there's a much positive to be seen in this network. And as a second thread running through these comments is that globalization can be accepted, but with certain conditions. It must be conditional. There's a call for regulation. There's a need to discuss the structuring and regulation of globalization so that it is not completely wild and uncontrolled, and in such a way that everyone can have a say, that we can all participate. That's one of the purposes of this open forum. We, as individual men and women of the street in Switzerland who don't really have a say in politics, can speak out, have our voices heard. Only then is globalization dignified. Yes, that's a very interesting comment. Usually in the open forum, we used to have the discussion from the floor at the end of the comments from the panelists, but we're going to have an interchange. I'm sure that some people see things much more radically and are claiming deglobalization, that is the end that we have to work for. Now, I don't know whether you agree with this, or do you agree with what Mr. Stückelberger has said, that there are some positive aspects in globalization? The lady in white, Nina Benz from Pro Natura, Friends of the Earth in Switzerland. We organize the public eye in Davos. I have a question to all of the panelists, but in particular to Mr. Stiglitz. What is the role of the multinationals that are represented at the WEF? What is their role in the whole globalization process? If we are asking the question of who is the bad guy and the good guy, then we also have to ask the multinationals this question.
Well, I think the multinationals have actually have been an ambiguous role. In some cases, they perform in a role of helping move technology from the developed to the less developed countries, which can improve their opportunities, and also giving access to what's produced in the developing countries in the developed countries. So there are some cases, and actually quite a few cases, where the multinationals have actually played a role in the development process, and a constructive role. The criticism of the multinationals, I think, comes from the fact that, clearly true, that they are driven by profit motive, and that a recognition that the profit motive often leaves out a lot of things that are important to society. In a world in which there aren't environmental regulations, they're not going to be pushing in general for good environmental policies. In the developed countries, they have been constrained and have to obey certain environmental policies, but they've been working very hard with President Bush to get rid of those. At least some of them have. In developing countries where there aren't these strong environmental regulations, they won't necessarily pursue good environmental policies, although increasingly some of the companies have had such social pressure put on them that they are behaving more responsibly. The same thing goes on labor conditions. Some of them have the view that if we can get workers to work in worse conditions and save a few pennies, it's worth doing. Increasingly, they've been put under scrutiny, and they've recognized that something that many firms in the West have recognized, that you can often get more productivity by paying workers better, higher wages and providing better working conditions, and that actually treating workers well actually pays for itself. So again, there's a split policy. Let me give you one example of the split among the MNCs, the multinational corporations. One of the real problems, one of the areas where I think there's been the most abuses has been in the area of resource economics. The companies that take out resources out of developing countries. The motive for profit maximizing means that they have an incentive to try to get those resources at the lowest price, not necessarily at a fair price. Now, sometimes they can get a lower price by bribing a government official. So it's cheaper to pay a government official $1 million and then save on what you pay the country.
Professor, das ist der Moment.
Professor, I think that is the right time where we can ask the Minister of Finance the question. Does this really happen? Ministers do silver cross their palm?
Definitely. I mean, it does happen. I come from a country, Nigeria, that has had, unfortunately, a reputation for not being transparent and for a lot of corruption in the past. Why was that? Because we had almost 2 decades of military dictatorship. And under a military regime, it's very difficult for civil society, for individuals, to ask questions. And you find that during those regimes, a lot of bad things happened in the country. I mean, instances like Joe was referring to where, you have this collusion between officials, to whom you cannot ask any questions, and officials from, and people or companies from outside. Now, I hasten to say that one should not generalize too much. Some of them, like Joe said, are perfectly good corporate citizens who do a good job, and they don't try to bribe or rip the country off. But there are others who have colluded in doing this. And, you know, we have now, fortunately, in my country, a democratic regime with a president who wants to fight corruption, and we are fighting it. But we are finding cases stemming from the past of officials who have been bribed for one thing or the other, and they're being arrested. 3 weeks ago, President Obasanjo had arrested some former ministers and high officials who colluded with a French company, not to name names, sure. But, you know, and it's under investigation.
But so the international big business does support this anti-corruption fight, or not too much?
Well, now most of the companies, I think the world has also evolved, and the companies recognize they're working in a democratic regime, an open regime where people can ask questions. And many of them are supportive. But are we there 100%? The answer is no. And I want to stress that there are two sides to the picture. I'm finding, I've only been in my job 7 months, and I'm having lots of companies, indigenous, domestic, and foreign, coming to me to talk about their financial issues. What I'm finding is we have to be mindful that every time we talk of corruption, there are two sides to the question. Mm-hmm. Now, if developed countries are constantly telling developing countries to fight corruption, to clean up your house, which we should do, that's the right thing to do. But there's also, you know, if we are the supply side of corruption, there's a demand side of corruption. Where the money goes, you know, sometimes the stolen money goes and sits abroad. And one of the biggest puzzles that I have is why people, NGOs in developed countries and others have not risen up in arms to say, give back the stolen money that is in your countries. Now, Switzerland is setting an example by working with Nigeria to try and give back our money, and we are trying to demonstrate that we are a responsible country, we are doing things differently, and we will manage that money differently. We will put it in education, health. You can monitor us, you can look at results. But I would like to stress that it's very important that citizens in developed countries also ask their governments, what about the stolen money that is being kept in your country? Why not send it back? You're the demand side of corruption.
Can I just add?
Okay, ich komme gleich zu Ihnen.
You'll get your microphone in a minute, the lady in the red scarf. So let's have very short answers and questions so that we can have a lot of discussion. But we'll get an addition by Professor Stiglitz.
To show how difficult the problem is, when I was in the Clinton administration, we tried to get all the governments of the OECD to agree that bribes should not be tax deductible.
And that was difficult?
And that was difficult.
Not good. Yeah.
Okay, to anyone who would like to answer, do you really think that here at the WEF and in Davos we can meet the people who are to blame for starvation in developing countries in general?
Herr Stückelberger?
Just to link up this question with the first one, and that concerns the responsibility of the multinational corporations. First of all, we overestimate the MNCs regarding the jobs that they provide. It's only a very small percentage of jobs that are provided by the multinational corporations or assured by them or guaranteed by them. They are important actors on the economic stage, but they're not the only ones who can solve the problems or not the only ones that cause the problems. I think in general we can say the following. On the podium here at the Open Forum and also in WEF, we've had a dialogue, but I'll speak only about the Open Forum dialogue, on partnerships between multinational corporations, environmental organizations, development aid organizations, and others. I think there's a need for such partnership. We need means of cooperation to find common solutions. This may mean that we will still criticize the multinationals and ask leading questions. We do so in the food sector, in the textile sector, in other sectors as well. But we need to find a majority, a consensus, in order to find solutions to the problems. However, and that's the other side of the coin, the multinational corporations, just like the remainder of the economic sector, must be willing to accept some regulation. Let me just give you two examples to come back to capital exodus and flight that was mentioned by the Minister of Nigeria. There's a need for the willingness of companies and corporations to refuse such practices. This is also in relation to fighting corruption and also in relation to exerting pressure to bring about a reduction in taxation. That is the power that corporations have. They decide to establish themselves in a country only if they get tax alleviation and facilities, a reduction in the tax rate. And many studies have shown that this spiral, this downward spiral in fiscal matters, is one of the reasons why there's not enough means available, financial means available to create schools, to give education. And I feel that the multinationals are guilty here of exerting this pressure on governments to bring about a reduction in the taxes that they have to pay. And this is something where they have to assume their responsibility. Then with regard to fiscal behavior, here too, the North has to change its behavior, its attitude. A lot of progress has already been made. The OECD rules, which are now being implemented in national law in Switzerland, for example, is a good step forward. We at Bread for Others, for All, have always, and for the last 8 years, fought against such practice, such negative practice. And some monies have already been returned to countries for Nigeria, to Nigeria, for example. And we are willing to make sure that the money that is returned to countries like Nigeria is then used for development work and not simply put in the pockets of the next best minister or whoever. So that's a possibility of cooperation between us all. Then another question here for the lady in the red pullover.
Irene Meyer.
Irene Meyer. I have the following question. I've often heard here at this open forum that we have learned a lot. The people of the International Monetary Fund have said so. The people from the World Bank have said so. But there's this tremendous pipeline project which is going to cost a lot of money, and is going to go through Azerbaijan, Chechnya, and Georgia, where there's going to be a lot of expropriation of about 30,000 farmers in Georgia in particular. So how is it possible that nowadays such projects are still being financed by the World Bank and are authorized by states and governments, even though that they are very destructive also of the environment, that they will endanger underground water resources? The Minister of the Environment in Georgia was menaced and threatened with a weapon to ensure that this project would be implemented. Well, could I turn then to Mr. Stiglitz? How is it possible that such projects, of which one knows that they're not only for the benefit of the people, that they still see the light of day?
Well, I guess I'm glad I'm not at the World Bank right now with a question like that. On the positive side, to be a two-handed economist, actually there have been at official levels much more safeguards, both in environmental policy and in social safeguards, than there used to be. And one of the problems in some countries is that they don't turn to the World Bank anymore, because the World Bank has actually gotten tighter in demanding better safeguards. They just, and so that they look for private banks to help finance them. The answer to your basic question, though, is an easy one. Why do they do it? They're under pressure from profit-making opportunities. They see the pipeline as an opportunity for profit, and they make an argument. Let me give an example of one where the issue is really difficult, and in the end, I think a mistake was made, and that was the Chad-Cameroon pipeline, where there was an additional complexity that it was that the oil the revenue would, the government in Chad was a particularly oppressive military government, and so the money would help entrench the military and would actually probably be very badly spent. Now, the difficulty is that there were almost no alternative development projects for Chad. So as you think about what could they do to promote development, this was one of the few ideas they had. So that was the positive side. But the negative side was to realize that it would not actually promote development. It would only enhance the military power, and in going through the Cameroons, do very strong negative environmental damage. My view that I came to was that they should not have built it. The oil will be in the ground, and hopefully in 10 years, 20 years, there will be a better government, and then they can try to think about better projects and do it in a way that is environmentally sound, that will be more likely to be beneficial to the people. But there is an enormous amount of political pressure reflecting the economic interests that get put onto these institutions.
Jetzt nehme ich das Gespräch einen Moment auf.
I'll take back the dialogue back to the podium just for a time being. I read Mr. Stiglitz's book, and he wrote something that really struck me, and I told myself I'll ask him when I meet him next. He says that he was the advisor of President Clinton, and he gave all sorts of good tips, and he feels that Clinton might have been persuaded, but then the people from the finance ministry simply changed everything around and decisions were overturned. Could you then perhaps explain to us a little bit how this worked? I mean, Mr. Clinton was a New Democrat, he was a neo-conservative, he was not a neo-conservative like Mr. Bush, but nonetheless, he was also in favor of certain liberalization and neoliberal policies. But why is the strongest man in the world not the strongest? Is Wall Street stronger than the strongest man in the world?
Yes. The president needs to get elected and reelected. The president needs to delegate. No single person can make all the decisions, so he has to appoint somebody to run each of the divisions. He has to, he feels it's important to, once he's assigned the task to the Secretary of Treasury to manage financial markets, he has to show him that he trusts him. And unfortunately, the focus primarily is on domestic policies. International policies are very much on the side, and even worse, to the extent that they get much attention, the sole focus, and this was something I really was very critical of, but unfortunately couldn't do much about, the focus of international policy is how does it benefit the United States?
Could you not call him and Bill, we have to do something?
Well, his heart would be in the right place, but the votes were not necessarily in the right place. So to give you an example, he got elected on a platform that said jobs, jobs, jobs. So when it came to international economic policy, he focused on the question, what will be good for creating jobs in America? He didn't ask the question, which he should have asked, was, well, how do we create a fair economic system? The social agenda, the system of social justice, the concern about the poor inside the country did not get translated very strongly beyond the borders.
Yeah.
And I think that was a fundamental problem. I think now that he's no longer president, he is much more able to express a concern about those outside the United States.
Ja, ja. Wäre gut, wenn Sie währenddem Sie Präsident sind.
Well, that seems to be the way it goes. Another point then, Mr. Somavia. In Cancun, there was a clash between the poor countries and the others, and the poor told the North to liberalize their agriculture, and the North then said, well, that cannot be done so quickly, and then explanations were given on why it wasn't so difficult. But we seem to be paralyzed in a dead end after Cancun, and many critics have said, yes, this is a wonderful sign, But is it really a good sign? Others are saying, well, it mainly harms the poorest countries, the fact that everything is blocked. What do you believe, Mr. Somavia? What does it mean that we don't really know how to continue? Is this a good or bad sign?
Well, I think that a very good thing happened, and you have to deal with the consequence. The good thing was that for the first time probably in these international trade negotiations, developing countries came together and said, look, we are not simply going to underwrite what the United States, the European Union, and Japan decide. If some basic things that we believe should be there are not there, then we're not part of the agreement, and since the WTO works on consensus basis, there's no consensus. I think that from a democratic point of view, from a political point of view, that's a good evolution. Now, we continue to live in a world in which the power structure is what it is. So, of course, there is the reaction to that, and the reaction can lead to, more bilateral agreements, and in which, of course, the balancing power is unequal. So, of course, there may be downsides to this, and in generally speaking, developing countries will prefer decisions in the multilateral system, because within the multilateral system, if they can speak up, there's a lot of ifs. If they can speak up, if they are listened to, and they have influence, they organize themselves and have influence, they're going to get better results than in unbalanced bilateral relations with some of the big countries. Let me say that in that context, I think that one of the biggest problems is that the rules of the games are not fair. You see, at present, the case of agriculture is evident, it's been made, I'm not going to go back to it. There is no way you can have a fair international system unless you deal with agriculture. And that means that internally, countries will have to deal with those, in the developed world, will have to deal with the consequences of adjustment and other things. Nobody's against agriculture as a social fact of life. What people are against is that finally becomes an instrument of exporting to the developing countries under completely unjust conditions. But this is absolutely, from my point of view, obvious. There are things that are less obvious. That this model is promoting the global, the global, the global, and the global. And has totally forgotten local development, local communities, the places where people live, are born and live and want to stay there. You have a long recipe of what you have to do to become a part of the international economy, and you have a list this small.
But is there still some negative effects on the local worker in his small little...
Sure, let me tell you.
Yeah. Ich frage ihn eben, ob es sich, die können zwar von unten nicht mitsprechen.
Mr. Klapproth is repeating his question in German again.
Talking about, unfair rules of the game. So what happens? An entrepreneur in a developing country, and this I'm giving you practical examples, because the ILO, as you know, is tripartite. We have governments, we have representatives of employers, and we have representatives of workers in the ILO. Say, look, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm prepared to invest, we may create 50, 70 jobs, but I already know, because of the rules of the game, that at a certain point in time, I'm going to have to begin competing with large, multinational companies that are present in 30 or 40 markets. So that entrepreneur he's not an extremist. That entrepreneur says, look, I don't find this to be fair. I believe that I should have time to develop, to grow, to consolidate myself on the basis of, what I can sell at home. And then there's a moment in which you go out and compete. And these are the sort of things. For example, countries are told that if you want to really attract foreign investment and export, what you have to do is to create export processing zones. Now, export processing zones were promoted in the 70s, and they continue to be. But they were promoted with the idea that in the export processing zone you have to give a lot of tax concessions to attract the capital, and also a lot, if you can give some labor concessions, that would be all right. In circumstances, and I've discussed this with large multinationals, that I say, look, you pay 35, 40% taxes in your home countries. Do you really need zero taxes or very low taxes in poor developing countries?
What do they say?
The answer is no, but they give it to me. And the policy advice that they receive is that this is what should happen, so I'm not going to be fighting to get
for higher taxes.
Of course.
Do you think they would be ready to pay high taxes?
In the developing countries, have you seen the level of the taxes that they have it's illusory when those countries need those resources in order to develop.
Yeah.
But let me finish. But that's an issue that needs to be there. You cannot have and developing countries are then giving tax concessions and competing among tax concessions until you go to the lowest one. That I don't, it's not fair. It's truly not fair. But another thing that we're working with them is to say, look, that you may be stimulated not to recognize labor laws, but you can have a policy as a company. So one of the things that we from ILO are doing is to say, look, first of all, we have to revise this whole question of export processing zones. It's unjust from a fiscal point of view, it's unjust from a labor point of view. But on the other hand, now, today, up until this is not changed, we want the companies, on the basis of corporate social responsibility, to assume the commitment that they will be respecting the core labor standards of the ILO, which is freedom of association, collective bargaining, no to forced labor, not to child labor, the right to social dialogue. And these are very fundamental things. These are very fundamental things in which the companies, apropos of the question that was being asked about multinational companies, they can do that on their own.
I will come right to you, Professor Stiglitz.
Professor Stiglitz is like a fountain, and he seems to be writing a new book as we sit here. I'd like to ask the minister from Nigeria, does your government have this problem as well when you negotiate within the WTO? Do you have this problem of wanting to protect certain branches or activities of the economy that you don't want to expose to full-blown competition, and they tell you, well, no, it has to be open to competition?
Absolutely. We do. We have two sorts of problems. I think that, as Joe had pointed out earlier, it's not that one is against liberalization, but we have to realize that, certain of our industries, need time to develop, just as has been the case in the developed countries. And we have to distinguish between those that need time to develop and those that are just not competitive because they're inefficient. But often, it's not easy to convince, the negotiators on the other side that there's a difference between the two. They often think that we're just saying that to cover up inefficiency and inability to compete. It is true we do have some industries that would love to be protected forever, and because, they can't compete. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about genuine cases where, you do need to give time for these to develop. And we have difficulties convincing. And I think we need to get agreement that we should be able to protect certain industries to give us a chance. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to create jobs for our workers there, and our workers also need to work. We are not really interested in development aid as such. I just want to make that clear. Everybody would rather be able to have a job created and work, and not have people sending aid. In my country, people are very industrious, but if you can't have a situation in which jobs are created, in which investment, if you ask anyone in my country, they would prefer if entrepreneurs can come and invest in the country and create jobs, rather than sending development aid, because this works much better for everybody. So we need to take all those things into account, that there are these industries, and we are trying, as we negotiate, to make that case. It's not easy.
Do you feel sometimes that the international negotiators of the international finance institutions are kind of ideologists and just with their philosophy coming to your country and understanding nothing? Also, ich frage Sie, ob das, was der
question is just being translated by the journalist again into German.
Eine feste Philosophie haben, ob sie die so erlebt, die Leute.
Well, it's very interesting, this question, because, I used to work at the World Bank for many years, and until recently, when I became finance minister and had a good career there. So for me, it's interesting to answer the question, because when you're in real time dealing with problems on the ground, it's not nice and neat like it looks sometimes, and from when you're coming from an organization. I think that's the difference. I think people from the bank come with the best of intentions, let me just speak about the bank because that's where I work. But sometimes in real time, there are political issues involved, there are social issues involved, and it's not as neat that you can just come and apply the best economic model, you know, that is there. So this is where the difficulty comes, sometimes in making them understand that a country like mine sometimes is so complex. We have 130 million people, over 300 different languages, not dialects, languages, and none of them resemble each other. They're not mutually intelligible. Now, managing a country like that is not easy, and sometimes you have to trade social issues, you know, ethnic issues, religious issues. You have to balance it all. And in the midst of that, perfect economic applications or policy cannot always work. And that's where we get into dialogue when we're trying to balance.
Wie würden wir das mit 4
How would we, well, we can understand that we only have 4 languages and fewer inhabitants. Mr. Stückelberger, well, I think that is just one of the central issues and problems of globalization. That is the unanswered question. How can we work together on the worldwide level whilst at the same time respecting diversity, religious, social, cultural diversity? That is the difficult balancing act. How can we have globalization in a country with 500 languages or in a country with only 4 languages like in Switzerland? One of the basic problems I see as being the time factor. If you just take economic globalization, everything is geared to acceleration. Everything goes very fast. The processes are fast. Technology advances very fast. And it is mainly because of this speed that the globalization process is advancing so quickly. And this leads more and more to this feeling of being totally out of control, that we have no air any longer. We are lagging behind. We cannot keep up. And that causes this tension between the advocates and opponents of globalization. I'm quite convinced that many of us have the same feelings as some of the opponents of globalization. It's not because we're against globalization, but simply because we feel overtaken by the speed of everything. So we need to have a deceleration in certain areas that would be very much in favor of globalization. Let's take languages. Translation is a need, and it has to be taken seriously. This is a demand that we would like to make of the multinationals. For many years ago, we told the pineapple manufacturers in the Philippines that they had to translate the basic texts into the local languages. They cannot just promulgate everything in English, and that is a question of responsibility. It's a question of ownership. People have to have the feeling that they're being taken seriously. And same thing in Cancun. The fact that there is a paralysis arises from the fact that we want this deceleration. There is sand in the mechanism bringing the machinery to a halt, but there is a need for deceleration. In fiscal matters, same thing. We're not basically against globalization, but we absolutely need to guarantee participation. Same thing regarding the projects, the pipeline projects, whether it is the one in Georgia or in Chad and Cameroon. The central question is, how can you have the local population participating in the whole project? Sometimes there's a need to slow down things. Projects of the World Bank cannot always only be implemented in 1 year's time. Sometimes it'll take 2 or 3 years. It'll be a little more cost-effective or cost-intensive, but it'll be more social. To come back to this question of the fiscal oases and paradises, I just had a discussion with our new finance minister, Mr. Merz, and I told him exactly the same thing. The rich are simply taking their money out and taking them into these paradises, in fiscal paradises. But it is also very much a question of corruption. If there's no corruption any longer in these paradises, then people will no longer take their money there. Yes, let me just come in on this. In terms of corruption, you must understand that the multinational corporations have already made a lot of progress and taken steps fighting this corruption. Sometimes corruption is a result of poverty. There's a project that we are supporting in West Africa in favor of schooling and education, which is free of corruption. Same project in Nigeria. If the financing of education is reduced, if teachers' income is shortened, there are many parts of Africa where teachers are simply not being paid any longer. And there's a need to compensate for this shortfall in income. So you cannot really accuse everyone of leaning to corruption. We have someone here in the fourth row, gentleman who wants to put a question. Who else would like to put a question? Put up your hand so that we can organize the microphone. Okay, go ahead.
My name is Munir Anis. I am the Bishop of the Episcopal Church in Egypt and North Africa. I'm not a politician and I'm not an economist, but I live in the midst of my people in Egypt, the people who live in the different standards. And my heart breaks when young people who are educated come to my office and ask for employment or to help them because they are employed. The term globalization involves the whole world, global. And if it lost this inclusiveness of the developing and the developed, it will lose its meaning and it will not be beneficial for the poor. I want to say, before applying globalization and the standards of globalization, there must be an infrastructure for this. And this infrastructure is education, health, development, interfaith, dialogue, listening to the people in the developing world. And this requires very big commitment from the developed countries to be committed to the development and the education and the health of the developing countries so that they will be able to understand and to implement globalization standards. And if they are not that committed to the people in the developing world, what will happen? A very big divide, very big gap, poor, poverty, ignorance, injustice. And what this will happen, what this will lead to? Terrorism. And this will be a threatening to the developed world. So I think there must be, I agree with my brother here, there is a commitment and a lot of education needed to happen in the developing world.
Thank you very much, sir. Jetzt die Dame mit
Then the lady in the blue pullover.
My question goes to the Minister of Nigeria. Talking about conditions of labor, there was an issue last October in Switzerland, a media issue about children from Benin, the neighboring country of Nigeria, working in construction sites, something like working with stones. In German, the word would be Steinbruch, I don't know in English.
Quarries, in quarries.
Sold by their parents to traffickers who put the children in those construction sites. They were forced into labor like slaves. And my question would be to you, what are you doing to prevent these things from happening?
I answer directly because it's... Sure. What you have just said is true. It happened. And it was human trafficking. Parents in the Republic of Benin, which is next door to Nigeria. You know, parents who are poor, they had people come to them who said that they were going to put their children living with people and they would be sent to school and you know, they told them all sorts of lies. And they bought into this. They didn't know that these were smugglers who took the children across the border and put them into a construction camp where they were working. This was actually discovered by the Nigerian police, I'm very proud to say. And when this was discovered, it was a big scandal. And our president got in touch with the president of the Republic of Benin, and they went after the traffickers. This is a gang working. The UNICEF was called in by both governments, and UNICEF took charge of the children. They were taken back to the Republic of Benin and have been reunited with their parents. The traffickers have been put in custody. Most of them, and several of them have been caught, not all, because it's a gang that is operating. And those that have been caught are waiting trial in jails in both Nigeria and the Republic of Benin. So it is something that is reprehensible, not tolerated by the government, totally 100% against it. It is illegal, and it has been dealt with.
Thank you. Minister, short commentary from Mr. Somavia.
Yes, just to say that I think that it's so important that the issue of child labor was raised. I think that one of the most scandalous dimensions of what's going on is precisely the enormous volume of child labor in the world, which, as I said at the beginning, if parents don't have work, then you wind up with child labor. So it's directly linked to the economic policies. But we cannot wait for development to come and for the policies to get right, etc. So we need to act now. And one of the things that I think can bring us all together internationally, while we deal with the more profound issues of power that we have been discussing, can't we all come together around the simple objective of eliminating the worst forms of child labor, the hazardous forms of child labor? This is the proposal that the ILO has been pushing. We are inviting countries to take a commitment to eliminate the hazardous, the exploitative forms of child labor in a certain period of time. I'm just coming back from India, and that decision was taken for 2007. And we're saying this can only happen if the society comes together and there's an international support for this. So there has to be a government commitment. There has to be a commitment on the part of the Employers Association, because somebody is employing these children. Somebody is employing these children. So the employers and the companies, it is absolutely essential that they participate. You need the local authorities, and you need the religious groups, the different ones in different countries, civil society, trade unions, the political parties, Congress. This is not an impossible task. This is not something
reachable?
The consensus is reachable and it's moving. It's not close, but it's moving. And what I'm trying to say, you see, I know that journalists want things to happen right away, tomorrow. If not, it doesn't count, because tomorrow something else is going to happen. Let me talk seriously about this, because this is a very profound ethical question. This is not about what's the quick fix on this. We have to have an ethical commitment globally, at least, if we want a fair globalization, at least to get rid of child labor. And this is something that every one of us individually can decide to do. Every one of us individually has something to do and can contribute one way or the other for ending child labor. Some of the people in the developed world, a lot of the people in the developing countries.
What does he mean?
If we generate that momentum, it can happen.
Not buying clothes where we know there
are different ways. It's a very. But what I want to talk here now is it's the ethical commitment, and we will not. The problem with globalization is that it has developed in an ethical vacuum, in which market values and share values, are more important than human values. And one indication of this is child labor. So at least let's react on child labor through an ethical commitment to eliminate the worst forms of child labor globally.
That's very, very, very clear. Globalization is taking place in an ethical vacuum. Could I turn to Professor Stiglitz very briefly? Is this because globalization is being managed by economists? Is there any way we can fill this ethical vacuum? Or are those who are in control simply saying they have nothing to do with ethics, they're economists, and that's their specialty?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that economics not only has left out the ethical dimension, but traditional economics actually said it should be left out. The most famous idea in economics was that of Adam Smith, who said that individuals, by pursuing their self-interest, would lead to economic efficiency and the general welfare.
And that's not true.
And that's not true. One of the points of my new book on Roaring '90s is to show that the pursuit of self-interest, greed by CEOs, auditors, the banks in the United States did not lead to economic efficiency in the United States. It led to the bubble and the bursting of that bubble. And that same kind of mindset, the pursuit of self-interest, let's write the rules of the game to advantage us at the expense of others, has led to a lot of the problems we're seeing in globalization. It was a series, and the understanding of why that basic result isn't true is very much related to the work I got the Nobel Prize with. It was based on this idea of imperfect information. And what I showed in that work, which we all know that there's imperfect information. If there were perfect information, we wouldn't be able to tell you anything that we knew that you didn't already know. So there obviously are all kinds of imperfections and asymmetries of information.
You got a Nobel Prize for that, but is it still a minority opinion within economists? Or?
Well, the real interesting thing about it is within the academic profession, I think a majority of people recognize this. It's in the policy community, particularly at the IMF, and less so at the World Bank. They don't. The idea has not yet penetrated. I mean, an example. Let me give you one example very briefly. One of the things that has been very destabilizing is capital market liberalization, which is the flow of money into and out of a country that can cause so much havoc and was a problem in the East Asia crisis and so forth. Finally, as a result of a lot of pressure, civil society, academic, they finally came out with a report last March where they recognized that this capital market liberalization was not good for economic growth and led to instability. It took them a long time to recognize this. But in writing their report, they said economic theory predicts that it will be good for stability. Well, it's a very peculiar kind of economic theory. It's an economic theory based on perfect information. The modern economic theory that recognizes imperfect information says that may very well not be the case, that the invisible hand may be invisible because it's not there.
That's very interesting. It's interesting to see that many of the political streams defend this kind of central economic theory. Yes, I think that is very true. If we had a value-geared globalization, we'd be much happier. But it's a very basic question, and I think there's more willingness even in the economy in favor of such values. But which values? And as an ethicist, I would ask you, what are the basic values? If we take the topic, the subject of this year, the partnering for prosperity and security, then prosperity and security are two values that are named. I'd suggest that for next year, WEF would have partnering for peace and justice, another two values, peace and justice, very basic values. So we have to ask which are the values that should be discussed and accepted and put at the center. But I think that, as Mr. Somavia said, the basic value of justice is simply not sufficiently debated or considered. Social justice must be a component, an integral component of globalization. I think generally everyone or more people would be in agreement in introducing more of these values in the economy and of practicing these values. But then it's a question of choosing the values. Here there's still some polemic about which values have to be chosen. I'm sure that fair and equal distribution should have more be more content again.
Yes, I would just like to give an example of what Christoph was saying, and it's in the world of work. Work is part of the cost of production. So you have a labor market, and you discuss, with the labor market, and you have minimum wages, and you discuss whether more flexibility, less flexibility, more security, all that happens in the labor market. But at the same time, for the person that works, that work is a source of personal dignity, because you prove yourself through work. So the relationship between work and dignity is enormous. It's a source of stability for the household, for the family, for the framework within which you live with others. It's a source of peace in the community. I mean, it has a number of other social values. And I think that what has happened with this model of globalization is that all of these other parts have not been taken into account. So you wind up having a feeling that there is a devaluation of the value of work. And I think that this is extremely serious, because I think that the quality of a society is very much based on the quality of work.
Okay. Just wait. Yeah, short statements, short questions, but short, yes. Alle kurz jetzt.
I think one of the real problems on the notion of social justice, and this reflects the question you asked me earlier, is that too often social justice stops at the border of the country. We've globalized our thinking about economics, but not about issues of social solidarity and social justice. And unless we change that mindset, and that reflects the question that was asked earlier, it's going to be very hard to make globalization work.
Thank you, Chair. Craig Bennett from Friends of the Earth International. The panel has made a couple of comments which I thought were very interesting and which I agreed to, which was that globalization can only be dignified if there's appropriate participation. And Joseph Stiglitz also pointed out that the problem with people who think only inflation is the real problem rather than unemployment is because they don't spend time with people who are unemployed. Doesn't this touch on really at the heart of the problem that many people have with the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, that it is a get-together of politicians with just predominantly the chief execs of the biggest companies worldwide, rather than really involving civil society in anything other than a tokenistic way? And do you not think that the response of the World Economic Forum to this sort of criticism has fallen short? For example, this year, just 2 weeks ago, we asked the World Economic Forum to provide us with a participants list for the annual meeting this year and a copy of the detailed agenda, and they refused. It was leaked to us anyway, and today we've put it on our website. But don't you think that the World Economic Forum should disclose that information? Similarly, the response has been this, the open forum. And yet, what we find here is not really enough critical debate between the good guys and the bad guys. We seem to have a lot of the good guys who are saying all the good things, but none of the bad guys. And we know this is a problem that the open forum, and we understand this, has experienced, and it's tried to invite the chief executives of companies here, even for a panel today. But with just a handful of examples, they've failed to come. Some of them have been
here. Mr. Brabeck, I guess, or... Some have.
But surely, if you're going to have a sensible debate on a panel like this, you need someone there from the corporate community to put their point, and for that to be examined in public. And the fact that they're unwilling to do that, in the way you've asked the question at the start of this panel today, doesn't that help us define them as the bad guys if they don't want their views examined in public? Okay. So the question is what can we do to make sure these people come out and interact with the public more, and then they might discover that in actual fact the views that they are trying to put behind closed doors to politicians in there are not really the ones that many people worldwide hold. Thank you.
Okay, das ist eine große Frage.
Yes, that is the question. That is taking the bull by the horns, indeed, and that is what the critics say. Is this a secret meeting of the world's elite debating how to improve their strategy, or the other opinion, is this a meeting point for the powerful who come here to have a dialogue with their critics? Now, I don't know whether you've discussed this at all, but I'd be quite interested to hear from you how you see it. What is the direction that WEF is taking?
Well, let me say that I arrived here on Thursday, and I was coming from Mumbai, from the meeting of the World Social Forum that normally takes place in Porto Alegre. Joe also was there. Normally it takes place in Porto Alegre. This time it took place in India. I think that generally, people have the right to organize themselves the way they want to. So we both were invited to the Social Forum, an extraordinary energy. I would say the most important thing that you saw there is organization. Every single group that was there had organized themselves nationally or wherever to be there, and yes, very strong criticism of globalization for the different reasons that we're talking there. they will have to decide how and when and in what manner they want to, interact with other actors. But if they want to meet, if the social forum wants to meet among themselves, move forward, generate their energy towards the future, see if they have some common actions, I think that they have the right to do so. What I want to say is that this is a forum of business people, who are meeting as business people and who are discussing a number of things among themselves, and in which I think it's difficult to simply have a totally black and white picture. To say every multinational company in the world is the bad guy, I don't think so. There are good companies, there are so-so companies, and there are corrupt companies, and we've seen that. And unless we are able to make that distinction, it's very difficult to make the analysis.
So you think it's I have to speed up a little bit, I'm sorry, but you think basically it's okay?
No, basically what I'm saying is these people are meeting here, they're inviting other people to listen, we discuss, but it is their meeting.
Okay.
This is what I want to say. It is their meeting, and it is the way others. I participated in Brussels in the Global Progressive Forum that was discussing, how is it that you replace, and it was the meeting of the Global Progressive Forum. There is a certain element there that you have to acknowledge as a reality.
Yeah, I agree, but there's one, your question raised, I think, one deep problem, which is the role of the government leaders who are here and are hearing one set of voices and are not hearing some of the other voices. And you see that, just let me mention one issue, that in the discussion of economic policies, they keep emphasis on the importance of structural reforms. And underneath that discussion of structural reforms are a lot of reforms about labor markets. A lot of those labor market reforms in an environment where you would have the other side there, the people who are worried about their job security, present a different picture. Economists have an ambivalent feeling about this because there's both a concern about employment and security. But I think that it has struck me that because of the lack of full representation, the other side is not getting heard as loudly as it should.
May I comment on this?
Ja, just go ahead. Und das Mikrofon für die Dame dann hier. Yes, Minister, please.
Just to say that, well, this has been my first meeting in Davos, and I think it's a fascinating forum. But one of the comments or observations I was making, and we'll share with them, is that I think that you need more developing country voices. I find that, the diversity was not enough. And, I think they could introduce this. Now, they've started having regional ones, but I think it's not quite the same. We need to get more developing country official and non-official voices into the forum.
Dankeschön. Herr Stückelberger.
Thank you, Mr. Stückelberger. Just very quickly on this question of the open forum.
Of the CEOs, and they came. The CEO of Alcan, of Merrill Lynch, of Anglo-American, of Nestle, and I think it's an important part to have this kind of dialogue. So I fully agree that is important to have this direct challenge and dialogue, but it's also important to have it not only here in Davos, but to have it in the countries, because most important is the concrete cases. We had the cases from Brazil, from Colombia, from other countries, so that people in the countries have the dialogue with these companies on their concrete behavior in the country. So I think both levels are necessary. What we do here, if we have the chance to have the CEOs here in Davos, we have to dialogue with them, to challenge them, but at the same time, that can be only fruitful if there is a concrete dialogue on concrete cases, being a pipeline, a mine, or whatever, a water source or whatever, to have a dialogue on that level, which is as important as to have it here.
So, wir haben noch 5 Minuten.
Well, there's 5 minutes left.
Short answers for the last 5 minutes, yes.
Ich heiße Bärbel Warten.
Bertel Potter, I've been a participant at the WEF. I'm a guest. I'm a bishop in the north of Germany, and I would like to talk about this inclusiveness or exclusiveness. I myself was surprised by how many businessmen were not invited. This also was reflected in the discussions. There were politicians, scientists, religious leaders. But nonetheless, I would like to support what the minister from Nigeria said, and that is that we have to have much more inclusiveness, and we need to have people who are directly affected who are included. The second thing I wanted to say is the following. Mr. Stückelberger has mentioned participation often. One of the values that is highly appreciated in WEF and is used often is democracy, democracy, democracy. And I think that is a point of interface for the continuation of the dialogue, because indeed we cannot ask for less in globalization than is standard accepted at the national level, and that is to say, to have a standard of living that is acceptable to all. Now, I have understood that the economy is interested in multilateral solutions, but these multilateral solutions have to be in harmony with democracy. And I hope that this is an interface for WEF and for all the organizations that are concerned and are active, because then I think globalization and democracy could be harmonized to a great extent. Do you have a question that can be dealt with in 2 minutes? Because we have to finish on time, because there's a question of TV transmission.
Somavia, about international labor standards, and they are today mainly applicable to states and to trade unions and to economic associations. Don't you think it would be needed to have binding international labor standards on multinationals, and that they're bound directly, also in order to de-accelerate this kind of race to the bottoms in terms of labor rights? Thank you.
Yes, I think that it's essential that the actors themselves first respect the law. So that's one basic element, that if you have the law in the country on labor standards has to be respected. But in terms of corporate social responsibility, you can go much beyond. So you can take private voluntary initiatives, and that can also lead further down the road to different voluntary ways in which the decisions that you've taken can be monitored, and eventually to some commitment among groups of enterprises and others, for example, for things that are already happening, which are agreements between a particular company and the global unions. And the company commits themselves to the respect of a number of ILO conventions and standards, and in agreement with the trade union, with the global trade unions, this is monitored. So we are moving in the direction of what you're saying.
Besten Dank. Jetzt wird.
Thank you very much. The TV transmission will end in 30 seconds, and we will continue in the hall. Mr. Vip will be taking the floor. I'd like to ask all of the panelists and all of the participants in the room for having taken part. Perhaps the economist who's a little better known than Mr. Stiglitz is John Maynard Keynes, and he said that in the long term, markets may regulate everything, but your answer to that in the long term we're all dead. But let's hope that the long term is far away. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.